And now, it's really a great pleasure and privilege to introduce to you our featured scholar for this evening, Dr. Sternfeld. He's an associate professor of history and Jewish studies at Penn State University. He is a social historian of the modern Middle East with particular interest in the histories of the Jewish people and other minorities in the region. His first book, Between Iran and Zion, Jewish Histories of 20th-Century Iran, published by Stanford University Press in 2018, examines, against the backdrop of Iranian nationalism, Zionism, and constitutionalism, the development and integration of Jewish communities in Iran into the nation-building projects of the last century. He recently published with Iranian journalists Hassan Sarmakhchian and Parvana Aymandish the book Jews of Iran, a photographic chronicle, with Penn State University Press 2022. And he is currently working on two book projects, the Origins of Third Worldism in the Middle East, and a new study of the Iranian-Jewish Diaspora in the US and Israel. In addition, he has written on current political and regional issues for outlets such as Haaretz and Tablet magazine. Dr. Sternfeld is also the co-recipient of a substantial grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities for a project that comprehensively challenges conventional thinking about the history of Jews in the Middle East. Titled Reimagining Jewish Life in the Modern Middle East, 1800s to the Present, Culture, Society, and History, the project brings together over 30 scholars and grows out of a concern that historical accounts of Jewish life in Middle Eastern countries fail to tell a full and accurate story. The project will ultimately result in a multi-author monograph as well as a special edition of this prestigious journal, Jewish Social Studies, shining an important light on the long history of close interactions between Jews and other groups in the Middle East before the dramatic changes that occurred during the first half of the 20th century. Please join me in welcoming Nira Sternfeld.
Thank you so much, Nathan, for this kind introduction. And I really want to thank Daniel and Muriel and Nathan, the Center for Jewish Studies, for this wonderful opportunity, and Beth Jacob Synagogue for hosting us. You have a beautiful city, and everyone was so nice and kind, and I'm really truly honored to be here. So on my way from the airport, I had a very nice Uber driver that asked me what I was doing here. I told him I'm going to talk about the Jews of Iran. And he asked me, the Jews of Iran? I said, the Jews of Iran? He said, I thought that you were talking about the juice of Iran that nourish the land of the country. He said, you know what? I'm going to use this metaphor. I'm not sure how, but I like the idea of the Jews of Iran as the Jews of Iran, maybe. So I'm presenting here something for the first time. The project on the diaspora, on the Iranian-Jewish diaspora, is a new one. I hope that I know enough to talk about it. I have two caveats. One is I usually talk for a longer time than I'm given. Second, which is going to counter it, there is no place for the charger here, so I'm on borrowed time until my battery dies. So we'll see what comes first. So we're going to talk about the Iranian Jewish diaspora in the US and Israel. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Iranian Jewish community in Iran today. And this came out from my first book. I say first book as if there is second, but this will be the second book. I studied the development of the Iranian Jewish community or communities during the 20th century. And the book ended with the 1979 revolution because everything changed then. And for me, going to study the Iranian Jewish communities after the revolution, I had to follow three different trajectories. One is from Iran to Israel, one from Iran to the US, And the third movement was more within Iran, from the villages and towns to the big cities, especially Tehran, Isfahan, and Shiraz. I'm going to give you just very brief, background information on what happened during the second half of the 20th century in Iran. So before 1948 and the establishment of Israel, there were about 100,000 Jews in Iran. There were a number of surveys that were conducted in the 1940s, mostly by the JDC and Alliance Israélite Universelle. One is a charity organization that you all know, the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, and the other is French Network of Education. So we know that there were about 100,000 Jews. Between 1948 and 51, 53, about 20,000 of them migrated to Israel. So the vast majority decided to stay. But Iran was also the second country that recognized Israel, the second Muslim country in the Middle East to recognize Israel. So Israel used Iran as a base for migration operation from India, from Afghanistan, from Iraq, from the Persian Gulf, and from Iran, of course. So it made many Jews from the other countries come into Iran. And some of them chose to stay in Iran, especially the Iraqi Jewish community that started to move to Iran in few waves. One of them is in 1914 because of conscription to the Ottoman army in the First World War. And then there was another wave that came in 1941 after the Farhud. And they concentrated especially in Abadan, in the Persian Gulf. And then in 1948, another wave of Iraqi Jews came to Iran. Most of them continued to Israel, but some of them stayed in Tehran and established an Iraqi Jewish community in Tehran. Now, unlike other Jews from the Middle East, Iranian Jews had the option of going back. Right? Iranian Jews who went to Israel could go back because of this relationship between Iran and Israel. Iraqi Jews could not go back to Iraq. They famously got the stamp that they live without return. Egyptian Jews could not move back to Egypt. Iran was pretty much the only place in the Middle East, again, with the exception of Turkey and Morocco to some extent, that had that left more options open for the Jews. And so in 1948 to 1951, we see migration of 20,000, total of those who migrated to Israel, 20,000, and some of them moved back to Iran, and some of the Iraqis that moved to Israel moved back to Iran. Now, I want to show you a couple of examples for what was the discourse, the political discourse in Iran at the time. For example, Shmuel Chaim was a Jewish representative in the Majlis, in the parliament in Iran. And he talked about, he was a Zionist, he was self-proclaimed Zionist, he was at some point the leader of the Zionist organization in Iran. And he said that Zionism was a very good development, but for the Jews who cannot stay in their homelands. And he was talking about the European Jews. He said that for Iranian Jews to think about Zionism a lot, to be in this imaginative realm, they are going to lose their rights and their fight for rights in Iran. And everybody wants them to be occupied with the thoughts of relocating to Israel, moving, selling, leaving the country. But their true interest is to remain in Iran. Chaim was executed by Reza Shah for false. He was falsely accused for being complicit in an attempt to assassinate Reza Shah. But it's just to show you that the Zionism was not a static thing in the political thought in Iran. And so when Jews from Iran migrated to Israel, they already had more like sober idea of what was waiting for them. Yet, this is a story from Davar, which was a daily newspaper in Israel, one of the biggest, most known newspapers in Israel, and it reported on 80 families that demonstrated in front of the Sochnut, the Jewish agency building in Tel Aviv, demanding to return them to Iran. 80 families from Iran asked to be returned to Iran. They said, you got us out of Iran, we want to go back to Iran. There was another example for mass protest of Iraqi and Iranian Jews in the Ma'abara, the transition camp of Amisav, and they all wanted to be returned to Iran, the Iraqis too, and they held signs, we don't want Ben Gurion, we want Nuria Said, the Prime Minister of Iraq, and we want the Shah. This was a story, and we saw how Iranian Jews actually used this privilege of being able to return. There was another example of Stanley Abramowitz. He was the JDC director in Iran at that time, and he wrote a report in 1951 saying that Iranian Jews from Nehevand sent letters to their community from Israel. And in one letter, they sent a piece from the Torah scroll that they took with them. And they asked the Nehevand Jews not to move to Israel until they tell them that the time is more suitable. I have the whole quote in my book, but I forgot to bring it. And one family was advised not to come to Israel until their son Joseph is married. Joseph is 1 year old. So this had an effect on the level of interest Iranian Jews showed in migrating to Israel. And in 1953, the migration to Israel pretty much stopped. In 1961, there was a memo of the Ministry the Ministry of Aliyah, Observation of the Aliyah, and they said, we don't have to try convince Iranian Jews to come. They are like the Jews of England, Australia, and South Africa. They're not going anywhere. And indeed, in the period between the 1940s and the 1970s, we see the Jewish community undergoing tremendous transformation. In the 1940s, 80% of the community, by the surveys that were conducted by the JDC and the Alliance, 80% of the community was lower middle classes and impoverished classes living in the rural and the social and geographical periphery of Iran. In 1977, we have, again, very large survey of the Iranian Jews, and about 80% of them were in the middle and upper middle classes. And this is in the span of less than 4 decades. There are many ways to explain it. Part of it is the migration of 20,000 Jews from the lowest classes that moved to Israel and therefore removed the responsibility of the community towards them. But there were many other things. The Iranian society has changed, but the Jewish community changed even more. And they moved out from the Jewish spaces, the Jewish neighborhoods, the Jewish quarters, into the upscale neighborhoods in Tehran, in Isfahan, in Shiraz. At some point in the 1970s, They are so assimilated and overrepresented in many fields that, 2 out of 18 members of the National Academy of Sciences, the Royal Academy of Sciences, were Jews. 600 out of 10,000 physicians in the country, 6% were Jews. And the population of the Jews was less than half of a percentage. And it goes in journalism, in entertainment, in many fields they were overrepresented, and they felt that they were part of the society. Their Iranian and Jewish identities were equal in importance and the way that they carried. There are many memoirs, beautiful memoirs from that period that show, the commitment and the feelings of being part of this national tapestry. And then, if you understand that they were part of the Iranian society, you are not surprised when the Iranian society starts to think about the monarchy, the Shah, as a dictator that needed to be removed. The Jews were there too, because their concerns, their grievances were not as Jews in Iran, but as Iranian Jews. The protest movement was growing constantly, especially in those middle and upper middle classes, the circles of the trade and the universities and the unions. And Jews were part of this movement. In fact, in March 1978, 9 months before the Shah left Iran, there were elections to the leadership of the community. And the group of Jewish revolutionaries won the elections. And they used the synagogues to talk about the advantages that Jews will have under an Iranian republic. And they convinced the membership to be part of the revolution, to be part of the Iranian nation. This is a picture from a demonstration in September 1978, one of the biggest demonstrations in the revolution. And 12,000 Jews from Tehran participated. 12,000 out of probably 50 or 60,000 Jews that lived in the city took out to the street that day. This is the newspaper that was published by the Association for Jewish Iranian Intellectuals. This was the name of the revolutionary group. They also operated a fascinating operation from the Jewish hospital in Iran. And they took in wounded protesters so they wouldn't be picked up by the agents of the Savak, the secret police. Anyway, when the 1979 revolution happened, we see many of that social class, of the middle and upper middle classes, live in Iran. So if in the late 1940s, early 1950s, we see the movement of Iranian Jews almost exclusively to Israel, now we see the movement of Iranian Jews almost exclusively to Southern California, to Tehrangeles. We see, again, this is, by the way, designation of Google Maps. The area in Los Angeles is recognized as Tehrangeles. And we see Iranian Jews moving to the same places as other people of their social class, having the same kind of reflections on what had happened to them in Iran. About 60%, 70% of Iranian Jews that left Iran in the first decade moved to Southern California, and then about 10% to New York, that joined an already existing community of Mashhadi Jews, and this is another story. And then about 20% moved to Israel. Now, To come as an Iranian to Los Angeles in 1979 was not an easy experience. I want to remind you that this was the November 1979, the hostage crisis, that changed, I would say provocatively, that changed America almost the same way that it changed Iran. I don't know how many of you know, but the 24-hour news cycle started with the Iranian hostage crisis. And there were demonstrations in Los Angeles. This one is in front of the federal building in Los Angeles, demanding deport all Iranians. And Iranians out, go home. And there were hate crimes against Iranians. This is the emergence of an old new identity, the Persian identity. This was a way to distance themselves from what the average American saw on TV. We are not Iranians, we are Persians. And there was a whole, move of recreating the Iranian-Persian identity, the Jewish Iranian-Persian identity. Now, think about it. Community that was very well off. We talk about them, in the late 1970s. They were very visible in Iran. They came to the US as new immigrants. After, it's no longer the period of mass migrations to the US that communities were able to, that were distant memories for most other communities, especially in the Jewish context. And they had to redefine themselves vis-a-vis the non-Jewish Iranians and vis-a-vis the American, mostly Ashkenazi Jewish community. What happened in this process was that they started to think about their experiences, borrowing terms from the Ashkenazi Jewish experiences from Europe. What do I mean? This is, for example, there was one major book on the history of the Jews of Iran. It was written by Habib Levy, who was dentist by training, but he was the historian of the Iranian Jewish community. He was a very wealthy man. He was the owner of the biggest pharmaceutical company in Iran in the 70s, had a number of hotels in Israel, in Iran, in the US, in Europe. And in his book that was published in 1961, he added this photo of one of the entrances to the Jewish neighborhood in Tehran. And it's written in Persian here, Yagi az Mahaleh Yehudi Tehran. Very neutral, descriptive language. When the book came out in English in 1999, it says an entrance to the Tehran ghetto. The same photo, the same place in the text, but it's the entrance to the Tehran ghetto. You can argue that ghetto originally was meant a gated neighborhood, usually occupied by Jews, but post-1945, when you say ghetto, you don't talk about the ghetto of Venice. You're talking about ghettos in Europe during World War II. And I think that this was a way to explain to the American Jewish community, or to show the American Jewish community they too suffered. I'm not arguing that there was no suffering, But this was a way to connect to the American Jewish experience. Events of unrest became pogroms. Oh, it's already showing me the low battery. I'll get back to it because I have few photos that I want to show you before my computer dies. One of them is the Iranian presence on January 6th, the riots in the capital. There was a group of Iranian Jews carrying the Pahlavi flags, storming the capital. And when we look at this, we can also understand, like we can see how they came full circle. As within one generation, from wanting to overthrow monarchy to reinstating a monarchy. And I want to get deeper into it, but I want to show you, this is, I'll get back to this in a second, but the usage of pogroms to describe violent events in Iran became more common. The issue of whiteness became a major issue, not just among the Iranian Jews, but in the Iranian community in general. There was also a political construction. Iranian Jews, I think more than other groups, associated the revolution with the weakness of the Carter administration and became ardent supporters of the Republican Party. Now, for them, this was a way to, again, to distance themselves from Iran, from the Islamic Republic of Iran, but also to build walls around the Iranian Jewish community. They wanted limited interactions with the non-Jewish community, with the non-Jewish Iranian community in Los Angeles. They wanted limited contact with the non-Iranian Jewish community. But by piling up the political, sociological, the historical narrative of the migration, they built walls around the community so they protect the identity and the integrity of the community. Now, I want to mention a few things that we can open up to conversation later. But when we look on the development of the Iranian Jewish community, the Iranian Jewish diaspora in Israel, we see something very different. The Iranian Jewish diaspora, the Iranian Jewish community in Israel, as I said, had a very rocky start, right? Many of them felt very disappointed. Many of them had continued the connection with Iran through visits and relocation for work purposes and moving back and forth between the countries. But overall, in the community memory, the migration to Israel is registered as an upgrade. They moved from the lowest classes of the Jewish community in the 1940s to somewhat better financial, economic status, social economic status in Israel that they built throughout the decades. But they didn't have this kind of disappointment or breaking point with Iran as the Jews that left in 1979 had. And that idea or the feeling that the revolution stole their country. And where do we see it coming in? One of the fascinating expressions of it was in 2012 to 2015, the working of the Obama administration towards the nuclear agreement. In Los Angeles, in California, not just Los Angeles, In California, there were few surveys, polls, that were conducted by multiple organizations to see how popular is the idea of reaching a nuclear agreement with Iran. Overall, more than 50% of the Iranians in California were supportive of the effort. They had some reservations, they had some, what they thought should be conditioned as part of the process, but over 50% supported it. When they broke down the results, among Iranian Jews, it was only 15% that supported the nuclear agreement. At the same time, the CNN conducted a poll among Iranian Jews in Israel. And this is a fascinating document. It's online, the CNN archives, you can look at it. There are even some videos. And they found that in Israel, while the Iranian community is broadly considered very loyal voters of the Likud party and the right-wing bloc in Israel, while Netanyahu was trying to get international coalition against Iran, the Iranian Jews in Israel overwhelmingly supported the nuclear agreement. When you see the archives of the videos that was part of the story on CNN, one of the Iranian Jews in a Persian restaurant in Levinsky in Tel Aviv says, "It's like asking me, who do I love more, my mother or my father? I don't want Iran and Israel to fight. I don't want them to bomb us. I don't want to bomb them." And I think that we can attribute it to the moment that they left Iran. The sociological generation, the experiences, the story, the narrative of the migration. And we see the development of the California diaspora as something that led from hostile opposition to the nuclear agreement through ardent support of the US withdrawal from the agreement to the January 6th and the storming of the Capitol. There are many more points that I can make about it, but I want to end here before my screen goes black and to open the floor for questions. So thank you very much.
I think we can take questions informally. Just remember to speak up, please.
Did the fact that Iran was Shia Muslim, was that better for the Jews when they were there? And did a mosque have to be higher than a synagogue? I mean, those kind of things.
Shia has been the religion of Iran, the state religion, since 1501. So Jews had some 400 years to live with a Shia majority population. What you're talking about, the limitations of the Pact of Omar or the Dhimma rules and so on, it was enforced in some places at some times, but not everywhere at the same time. Usually the cities had no experience of it almost at all, and the villages had more of that. In the mid-1900s, we don't see mentioning of it anymore. This was in interviews and in memoirs, you see that this is something that the generation of young adults in the 1970s said that this was the experience of their father's generation. This was not something that they experienced, almost regardless of where they lived. It existed, but it wasn't a formative experience. And synagogues, if you see the synagogues in Tehran that were built in the 1960s and 70s, these are beautiful structures. I was lucky enough to interview the sons of the Muslim builder that built the Yusufabad synagogue. And he told me that his father was a very pious Muslim, and he asked the leadership of the synagogue if he can build Maghreb, the direction. It's like to signal the direction of the prayer for the Muslims in the wall. So while they build the synagogue, they can pray. And he said, after we finish the synagogue, we'll block it. And the leadership said, of course. And when they were about to finish the synagogue, the leadership asked him not to block it because it's part of the heritage of the synagogue. And this is something, I don't know, we can separate fact from fiction and romantic memories from the days of a bygone age. But it's not to say that everything was idyllic, but there wasn't sense in the everyday life. There wasn't sense of inferiority because of the Jewish religion or because of Jewish identity. I would say that the religious leadership of Iran today argued that attendance in synagogue today is better than it was before the revolution. Because today synagogues are funded by the state and they serve as social space for Jews, which they don't have many other spaces beside the synagogue. So they come to the synagogue, they spend time in the synagogue, they stay for the prayer, they stay for afterwards activities, but the Shia, the existence of Shia majority didn't affect Jews in the 20th century more than any other reason for tensions in some places. Yeah.
Sort of two-part question. One, I'm curious if you're aware of the Israeli TV show Tehran, which I find is really interesting, reflection on longing for each side, and so on. If you'd like to comment on that. And the other is, going back to my own experience in Los Angeles, do the Jews in LA have any kind of regular relationship with non-Jewish Iranians in other parts of LA? The Farsi language, the common connection to a past, the binding, or is the division between, I'm just curious about that.
So I'll start with the Tehran. Yes, I watched the first season. I have one diplomatic answer and one less diplomatic answer. First of all, I think that it's amazing that they brought a TV show that features the speakers of Persian so prominently on Israeli primetime television. This is something that could not have happened before, 20 years ago, and for that, at least now Israelis have the ability to identify the sound of Persian. Having said that, I don't like the framing of, everything Iran as part of through the lens of the Mossad. I don't think that it's not constructive. It's entertainment. I guess that there's place for that. But I don't think that it helped to bring, to open up the possibilities to view Iran in a more nuanced way than Israelis had before. I also think that part of the plot in the first season was tone deaf to what happens and what could have happened in Iran with this show. For example, in one episode, I think that it was the fourth episode, Every episode after it was on, like 10 minutes later, it was with Persian subtitles on Telegram. And it was very popular Telegram channel. But it also opened up, for people to respond to it. And in episode 4, the Mossad agent goes to hide in her aunt's apartment. And then there was this, it wasn't like a major debate, but it appeared in certain circles that you see the Jews, when they have to choose their loyalty, they are loyal to Israel. Now, there's a community in Iran today that tries to escape these kind of questions of loyalty. They don't want, for them, they live in Iran, they choose to live in Iran. They don't want their loyalty to be questioned. And from that episode in Tehran, it raised all those questions. And again, it wasn't something that went on, on national TV in Iran. But it was on Telegram and Twitter and other social media spaces. Now, regarding the question in Los Angeles, the cultural space is shared. Muslims and Jews and Baha'is and Zoroastrians share the same cultural spaces. There was a bookstore, Shirkat Kitab, on Westwood or Westwood. And it was owned by a Jew. Unfortunately, it went out of business a few years ago. But this was a place that you really could see everyone, regardless of their faith, religion, political views, everyone was there. When there's concert of Iranian performers, they all go. When Gugush is performing, nobody asks where what part of Los Angeles you are from. So the cultural spaces are occupied by all Iranians. The separation is, in the more community-oriented places, synagogue, community centers, student clubs in UCLA, and so on.
For quite some time, there was a very interesting, strong relationship between the Sassoons of Baghdad and the Jews of Bombay. Now there aren't many Jews left in Iraq. There's still, how many Jews are there?
In Iraq, to the best of my knowledge, there's one. In Iraq.
How many in Iran?
In Iran, the numbers go between 10,000 to 20,000. Last summer, the chief rabbi of Iran said in an interview that there are based on community registrations, there are 15,000 Jews, and I think that it's a good number.
And is there still a relationship between those families?
The Sassoons and Kaduri are Iraqi.
Yes, I understand that. But there was a number of intermarriages between a Sassoon and somebody from India, from Bombay.
So, yeah, it bypassed Iran. Yeah.
Yeah. My question, you discussed the diminished Jewish population in Iran, and especially after the War of Independence, and that there was a fairly large population of Iraqi Jews that went there.
Yeah.
My question is, when you did your interviews and so on, did you find that the diaspora, Iraqi Jews that lived in Tehran, thought of themselves as Iranian Jews and had an attachment to Iran like the Iranian Jews, or they never left their Babylonian roots?
This is a very good question. So the Iraqi community, especially the first generation, was Iraqi. At the Fox School, that was a compound of school, synagogue, and club, was run in Arabic. It was Arabic-speaking space. The synagogue had an Iraqi rabbi. They didn't want to mingle too much with the non-Iraqi Jews. The second generation was very different. Because of, first of all, the Iraqi community, I think, felt more secured, so they weren't so much afraid for loss of community values by associating with Iranian Jews, but also because of necessities. When they had to bring more kids into the Iraqi school, they opened up to non-Iraqi kids. And in the 1960s, another principal came to run the school, and he wanted to open it up to non-Jews. And by the 1970s, it was ranked one of the top schools in Iran, and 50% of the student body was not Jewish. So there's also perception of what others attributed to the institutions and how it affected the way that the institutions run. But in the beginning, the Iraqi community was very isolated. They didn't see themselves part of Iran. And also, I think that it took them, again, one more generation to feel some connection to Iran itself. Ironically, in 1979, when the Iraqi Jews went again to three places. One was Israel, the second was London, and the third was Los Angeles. And in Los Angeles, they became part of the Iranian community. They became more Iranian than Iraqi. But in London, they joined the Iraqi community.
Where was the community you said that became more Iranian? Was it Los Angeles?
Yeah.
They also went to Montreal and other places.
Yeah, but the majority moved to Israel, London, and then, you're talking about the Iraqi community from the 50s. I'm talking about the Iraqi community from Iran. Yeah.
So Los Angeles is a melting pot.
In a way.
I'm wondering, as I'm thinking about this question of identity, like what does it mean for Jews to say they're Iranian Jews or Jews from Iran, I'm wondering to what extent, and you've been talking about sort of religious difference, Muslim, Baha'i, Zoroastrian, to what extent do Iranian Jews interact with narratives of ethnic difference and minorities? Like in Iran, there are also Kurds, Armenians, is there a sense in which Jews might consider themselves or be considered an ethnic minority? And do they relate with other narratives of ethnic identity?
This is a great question. I think that, the strongest card that Iranian Jews had in Iran in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s was that for the first time, they belonged to the majority. They were ethnically Persian, and this was their card to enter the Iranian society. Iran is a country of minorities. There are 27 minorities in Iran. And when, the nation building project was based on non-religious identities, and the Persian and the ethnically Persian identity became, the basis for the melting pot in Iran, Jews for the first time were not minoritized. And so even Kurdish Jews that moved to Tehran became Persian because it was easy, it was beneficial. Now, there is erasure of ethnic identities, of sub-ethnic identities in the US and in the Iranian diaspora communities. Kurds, but also Armenians and Jews. And I think that we should develop the sensitivity to find the differences, but I would say that Los Angeles became another melting pot. They couldn't, if they had to gather around limited resources, they couldn't start splitting hairs and say, this is for the Kurds, this is, they had this, like, we now have to define ourselves vis-a-vis the general society here, and it's Persian, and it's like Persian, not Iranian, and it's something that I intend to study, like what happened with the Aramaic-speaking communities in Iran when they moved to the US, because I don't think in my studies so far I haven't seen sign for them, observing the cultural heritage of these communities when they moved out of the country. And they didn't observe it, they didn't preserve it in Israel, and they didn't preserve it in Los Angeles. And I think that the one place that allowed more of existence for sub-ethnicities was Long Island. That, every village opened their own synagogue. So it allowed more of the dialect to continue, and the shared experiences, and every village or every neighborhood have their own social space.
I get the impression that the political views of the Jews who remained in Iran are quite different than what you're describing in Los Angeles. Is there any forum for dialogue between those two different populations, or are they just quite different?
There's very much ongoing dialogue. These are the same families. These are families with one branch in Los Angeles and one branch in Tehran and one branch in Israel. And so it's not that they, ignore or overlook one another. They don't share the same views. It happens in the best families. There's also, there's a lot to unpack here in the relations also within the family. Like, what does it mean for them to choose to leave Iran or for them to choose to stay in Iran? And the question of, Iranian Jews, they travel. And they travel to Israel, and they travel to the US, and they spend time in all these places. And there is conversation going on, but there are different worldviews. And it's not, sometimes, when the community in Los Angeles or the community in Israel or the community in Tehran for that matter, there is the conversation that goes within the community and the conversation that is being part of, family conversation, right? In the community in Los Angeles, they are far more interested in what is going on with California, with America, with, the nuclear agreement and how to overthrow the Iranian monarchy, the Islamic Republic. The Jews in Tehran have other worries. They have to worry about, the business opportunities for them, and the schools that have challenges, and the community structures, and the relation with the majority society, and the relation with the government. So these are different sets of worries. I don't know if it answered the question, but this is disagreements.
One prong of it is I'm curious about like the current generation of young Iranian Jews, Persian Jews. How are they identifying and why? And
Thank you. I think that, and Daniel, feel free to correct me, I think that the Iranian Jewish community in Los Angeles, and it's definitely not going on in Israel and not going on in other places, is the only community where the third generation still speaks the language of the first generation. I don't know of any other Jewish diasporic community that was able to keep the language alive in that way. The Sunday schools in Los Angeles, they teach in Persian. And the kids have to study Persian. And this is part of the walls that I said that they build around the community to preserve it. This is one of them. The kids have to know Persian. And it's not Judeo-Persian, even though there are words and you know, certain words that are more identified with the Jewish dialect than others, but it's Persian, that the same Persian that other Iranians in Los Angeles speak. Judeo-Persian exists in some synagogues. I don't know that there is revival like the Yiddishist or the Ladino. I don't know if there is a revival of Judeo-Persian because, again, for them it's not a dead language. They don't have to revive it. It's very much a living language. So, and again, this is something, you know, when I compare it to the community in Israel, the third generation now wants to study, to pick up Persian. But their parents don't know it anymore. There are 2 or 3 generations removed from Persian speakers. So in Los Angeles, it's very much the language of the community.
Is there a sense that you have of intermarriage between Persians and non-Persians happening quite regularly in Los Angeles?
It happens. It happens in the best families. It's not something that is encouraged by the community. I can share an anecdote. One of my interviewees for my first book was very much active in the revolutionary movement. And when he told me his story, he said, you know, if people in this community knew what I did in '79, my daughters will never be able to marry here. And there's a lot to unpack here, like why do you limit the options of your daughters only to this community, but also you understand that this is something that affects the way that they reflect back on their life in Iran and their life in America and their relation with the community and the place of the community in their life. They are very much encouraged to stay within the walls of the community. I'm now doing one of the funnest and stupidest projects that I've ever done, and I'm writing an article on the Shahs of Sunset. I don't know how many of you watch this reality TV show, but there's one character there was dating a non-Iranian, non-Jewish girl. And he didn't know what will traumatize his parents more, that she is not Iranian or that she is not Jewish. And she can convert to Judaism, but she can't convert to Iranianism. So it's something that is not encouraged. They really try, you know, to keep them socializing with the community members and there is the movement between Los Angeles and Tehran is as such that sometimes when they don't find matching in the community, they go to Iran to find matching.
Always have.
Yeah. So they go.
Ashkenazis aren't accepted.
What's that?
Even Ashkenazis aren't accepted.
Not encouraged. I have to share another funny story. When I first came, my first visit to Los Angeles for the research, when I was still a PhD student with my dear friend Shaz here, I went to Los Angeles and with my wife, and I met someone who he passed away unfortunately last year. He became a very good friend of mine. He was a member, very active member of the community, and we didn't agree on anything, but he really wanted me to be able to conduct my research. So we were sitting in a Persian restaurant, and he told me, okay, we have to find you a Persian wife. I told him, I'm married. My wife is here. Said, not to worry, we have to find you a Persian mistress. With a name like yours, you will not get far. So there is, everything is, you get your credentials based on your standing in the community and who you marry in the community and how well you keep your kids in the community. And the community plays a very important role in the lives of every single member of it. Thank you.